Let's look today at how to restrict a column's value in TSQL. Now, this is something that you want to definitely be careful about because the best practice in many of these cases is to keep the restriction in the application layer. For instance, I would prefer to use C# to restrict, let's say, a name to be only within a certain amount of characters, plus that reduces the likelihood of just SQL injection. And then, of course, as well, keep in mind, let's say if we're talking about loan balances, and I've seen people do this where they'll only enter a loan balance equal to or above 0. Of course, I've seen environments who do the inverse too. It depends on what analysis you're doing. For instance, you may actually want to know if a loan is negative, which means, let's say you're a bank, and that means you owe customers money. But imagine if you excluded all of the loans that were negative. Well, then you wouldn't know about the customers that you owe money to. So, yeah, just make sure that you're not preventing analysis and you're not disrupting the client or customer. And then, of course, there are cases like exclusively database ETL or rare cases to use this technique. So let's look at an example of that. We're going to create a table here with the primary key identity 11, and then we're going to create a table with a name varchar. And you'll notice that I've just defined a constraint on this name. First, I couldn't enter a null if I tried, right? So it's not null, but there's also this constraint. And what the constraint is, it says, look, the name has to be greater than 3 characters, right? So if I were to insert John into this table, it'll go through. Well, what happens if I insert Xi, or Xi, President Xi, in China? Well, the insert statement conflicted with the check constraint con name. The conflict occurred in, et cetera, right? Well, that looks good and all, but let's suppose that I have records coming in batches. Let's use an example. So if we look at our table right now, we have John, right? But let's suppose I insert a batch, and in one of those names in that batch is Xi, right? Well, what's going to happen? Well, none of them are going to go through, right? So if I want to define logic to, let's say in this case, if I was really wanting to restrict a name, I would want that restriction to be in the application layer because .NET is going to be a lot faster at dealing with object by object, whereas TSQL is not. It's a set-based language. You'll notice the whole set failed, right? It's not something that I want to happen. And this is another good example of where, this is why I use this one over loan balances, this rule would be incredibly stupid. I've actually met people whose their first name was Y. Like that was their first name. And in fact, I think my grandfather, his first name was E. Like the letter E, one letter. So the other thing as well is, are you limiting what someone can do? Maybe people don't go by their middle name. Maybe that is their name is just Y, or maybe it's E. I haven't seen any other names like that, but like Xi, is a good example of, if you define a rule and it was 3 and the person's name is greater than 3, well, now it's just an inconvenience, or an encumbrance. So the key here is make sure that the rules that you define make sense. Make sure that the rules that you define, for instance, on the analysis side, if you are a bank and you owe money to the customer, you certainly want to know when loan balances are negative. But again, if you're only looking at mortgage-backed securities to buy, and you can't buy a mortgage-backed security, let's say, that has a negative loan balance, then yes, it makes sense to look at things that are above 0. In fact, you might actually want to go even higher than that because it may not be worth it to buy a mortgage, for instance, or a mortgage-backed security with loans below 1,000. So those are just some things to consider when looking at analysis.